Hey everybody, welcome back. We got a great one for you. This is per unit taxes, the incidence, and what we mean by that is burden of the tax, part one. This is a two-part video one, so please watch the second part because it's really going to bring it home for you. But let's get started, okay? What we've got is a situation, I got two graphs up here, and we got a situation where who is the government physically taking the money from? A better way to maybe say that is who has to physically pay the government? Who's writing the check to the government? Whoever that is, whether it's the producer or the consumer, that's the curve we're shifting, okay? So when it comes to what curve should we shift, the supply curve or the demand curve, it's all based on who physically pays the money to the government. Now, it's really the producer, okay? For the most part, this is the right graph, okay? It's the supplier or producer that has to pay the money to the government. When I go buy cigarettes, which I don't, but if I did, when I go buy cigarettes, I don't pay any money physically to the government. I don't write a check to the government. I just pay a little bit more when I buy the cigarettes, and then the producer or supplier of the cigarettes turns around and physically pays the government. And that's why it is actually technically right to shift the supply curve. But for this one, where we're focused on the burden or incidence of the tax, I also wanted to just assume there was a situation where where the consumer actually physically paid the government. It was the consumer that had to write the check. And here's the key, guys. It doesn't matter. It's technically right to do it this way, but it doesn't matter because the person who physically writes the check to the government has nothing to do with who's going to incur the true burden of the tax, the incidence of the tax. The burden or incidence of the tax has everything to do with the relative elasticities of the supply and the demand curve. Supply and the demand curve. Now, I did my best to draw these graphs pretty much the same. They're not perfect, but just think of them as the same. Think of the PES, price elasticity of supply, and PED, price elasticity of demand values, being the same for both graphs. Now, be careful here. I'm not saying the PES equals PED. I'm just saying the PED here equals the PED there, and the PES here equals the PES here. In fact, the PES and PED values are very much not the same. The PED, price elasticity of demand value, is much lower for demand, okay, in both situations because it's steeper, it's much lower, it's much more inelastic for demand than supply. Supply is much more elastic, which gives us a greater PES value than PED value. Hopefully that made sense. More inelastic demand, more elastic supply in both graphs, okay? So who's going to incur the greater incidence or burden of the tax? It's going to be the one that is more inelastic, okay? It doesn't matter who's physically paying the government. So let's go take a little closer look at this, okay? So in this one, like I said, the proper one, because this is how it works in the real world, the producer's physically paying the government, so we're shifting the supply curve. Look, supply equals marginal cost. Now it's supply with tax or marginal cost plus per unit tax, plus per unit tax. Why? Because now when I supply the good, I have an additional cost, an additional plus sign, right? Cost of supplying this, okay? That I have to now pay the government every time I supply the good. So here's what we're going to get. New supply and demand curve intersecting right there. That's going to be my price consumer, okay? The consumer's going to pay this amount, but that is not the per unit revenue to the producer. Yes, that vertical distance right there is the amount of money the consumer puts in the producer's hand, but then the producer turns around and pays that amount of money, okay? Oops, that's actually incorrect. Sorry about that, guys. I got to get my reference point, okay? It's actually right there, PP. Bring that across a little bit more, okay? The per unit tax is actually that amount, okay? It's from here, that dot right there, to there. There's the per unit tax. So there's the per unit tax. The producer turns around and gives that much money per unit supplied to the government. So consumer pays this much, producer hands that to the government, leaving the producer with per unit revenue of that amount, okay? You can see that's my PP right there. It's not incredibly easy to read my handwriting, but this is the PP. So what is the situation here? The consumer's price, okay, because I did mark PM originally, and PM was, of course, PC and PP, okay? PM equaled PC equaled PP pre-tax, okay, prior to the tax. Price consumer went up considerably from what they were paying. price producer, the per unit revenue, what they received went down, but not near as much. It looks like, to me, from the looks of this, the consumer's taking on about 80% of the burden, and the producer's only taking on about 20% of the burden. Why is that? Okay? The key is Q tax. That QD, QS are going to equal each other after the tax has been levied. They equal each other before and after. What am I saying? At Q market, this is prior to the tax. We had QS equals QD. Now the tax gets imposed, shifting the supply curve left, quantity supplied decreasing at all price points, right? So shifting supply left, we're now here at Q tax, and now QS equals QD right there, okay? So what's going on here? Well, for QD to decrease by the same amount as QS, the price had to change far more for the consumer. Why? Because they were more inelastic. Let me say that again. For QD to change the same amount as QS, the price for the consumer, there it is, PM to PC, that increase in price, had to be far greater because they were far less responsive to a price change, right? They were the one far more inelastic. So far more of the burden is being placed on them, or is being shifted to them, or you might even say being passed through to them. Not the entire burden, but a much bigger burden, but it has to do with everything about the elasticities of the curve. Remember, in this graph, it's the producer that's actually physically paying the government, but it's actually the consumer that's incurring the burden, okay, or the bigger burden. Let me be very careful. The producer is incurring a burden, but only about, like I said, about 20%, but they're getting a burden. All right, this situation, really weird. We've got the consumer physically paying the government. I don't know, they buy the good and then they write a check to the government. It's kind of strange, but let's just think conceptually that that was the case. It would be proper to shift the demand curve. Demand would shift left, decrease in quantity demanded at every price point. Why? Because the marginal benefit, hopefully you can see this little minus sign, that's a PU tax, really hard to see, but marginal benefit minus the per unit tax, right? Because look, there was a certain amount of benefit I got for buying the good, but now when I buy the good, I get the benefit of the good, but now I got to pay an additional amount to the government. That's lowering, okay, my overall marginal benefit, okay? So you can think of the marginal benefit curve is going down, demand shifting left, quantity demanded decreasing at all price points. All right, so kind of a strange situation, but that's what we're saying here. That's what we shifted. So here's the new intersection point, okay? Price, all right, producer. So the consumer is going to pay that to the producer. So that's their per unit revenue. And then I got to go grab this little dot right there, put it over. Like I said, it's not completely drawn perfectly. The goal was to get these two graphs the same exactly. They're not, but they're close enough. This point right here. So I went to that intersection of the new demand and the old supply. Went up there, got that point. There is my PC. Look how much PC went up. Look how much PP went down. Remember, price market was where PC and PP were pre-tax, okay? So consumers handing this much to the producer, then the consumer pays that much to the government. Remember, after they buy it, they got to send that check to the government. So the total, I'm just going to erase this little part right there. Total amount the consumer pays, this vertical distance, that's why it's PC. So PC, PP. So in this situation, we get the same in that one as this one, okay? The same thing's going on. Doesn't matter who's physically writing the check to the government. Demand was more inelastic. To get QS and QD to shift the same amount, okay? To get them to shift the same amount, the consumer is going to absorb much more of the price change. The price is going to go up far more for them to get QD to change the same amount. Let me say that again. Price has to go up more for the consumer than it changes for the producer because the consumer is far more inelastic, far less responsive to price changes. So they're going to absorb far more of the price change, okay? And our common sense should also help us out here, right, guys? Think about it. You're more inelastic, consumers more inelastic. That means, hey, they're not responsive to price changes. Hey, they're going to buy this because maybe it's a necessity or whatever the situation it might be. There's not many close substitutes, whatever that situation is. This is the situation, and we're seeing it in both cases that the tax, the burden of the tax, the incidence of tax can be passed on to the consumer, all right? So, PC above PP. Notice, We got the same result both times. It didn't matter which curve, shifting supply, shifting demand, didn't matter which curve we shifted. PC went up by a significant amount, PP went down by just a little bit. PC went up by a significant amount, PP went down by just a little bit. It was all about the relative elasticities of the curve, and the group or the market participant, supplier or demander, that is more inelastic absorbs the bigger burden. Demand, more inelastic, absorbing the bigger burden of the tax. Anyhow, thanks for sticking with me on that one. Come back for part 2 because that's when it's even going to get clearer. Thanks for tuning in. See you in the next video.